All right. Good morning, folks. I'm News 6 meteorologist David Nazario back with one of our morning weather shows. We haven't been able to do this recently because my schedule has been off the chain. I've just been kind of pulled in every single direction before Thanksgiving, during Thanksgiving, throughout the Black Friday weekend into yesterday, but we're here today. Only going to have, I believe, another show or two this week because that's just how crazy the schedule is for the holiday season. I believe Thursday, Friday, and into the weekend I'll be doing different hours, so I will not be readily available to do an 11:30, but I'm trying to make these as routine as possible. Good morning to those of you joining us on the News 6 Plus app, as well as those of you tuning in over on the News 6 YouTube channel. I'm not going to be streaming to just weather, as I'm going to be working on a long-form content video for that specific YouTube channel, so if you'd like to go check that out, post this live morning update, feel free to do so. It should be uploaded later on this afternoon, if not by the early evening time frame, delving a bit more into what it is we're going to be talking about today, because we do have a pretty decent amount. So with that being said, let's go ahead and rock into this. This is a look at our current water vapor satellite shot for us here in the southeast anyways. I wanted to bring this up because the primary topic of discussion is going to be wintertime. Now, as we all know, since Thanksgiving, especially into Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we had our first of multiple doses of polar air come on through Central Florida that came through crashing in like tidal waves you would see along the shoreline, whether it be rain, sleet, snow, or God forbid a hurricane coming ashore somewhere, to kind of give you a little bit of an analogy or a metaphor there. We're going to be talking winter because, believe it or not, there's going to be some strange things going on with our winter time pattern, and the biggest denominator there is going to be what the ENSO does, the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. I know a lot of you probably were thrown off when you heard Enzo. It's like, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's at Disney Springs, Maria and Enzo's. No, we're not talking restaurants. We're talking the actual El Nino or El Nino, La Nina, and neutral phases that the Pacific equatorial waters will go through on an annual year-to-year basis, and the cyclic nature behind that. So for the time being, we're still inundated by dry air. You can see we're actually looking at the base of the trough that has brought down abundant polar air from the Canadian provinces to the north, and it has managed to sweep its way as far south as Florida, the peninsula, going all the way through the Keys into the northern periphery of Cuba, down into the western Caribbean. A bit of a night and day difference in comparison to what had occurred during the tail end of the hurricane season, where I feel as if we were tracking system after system down there. Here's a quick look at our wind gusts. These are going to be the jet level gusts, and behind the colors there, you can see those white lines. Those are going to be your height levels, basically the tallness or the shortness of your atmosphere. Where you have higher heights, that typically means the air within that dome is warmer, kind of like the plastics or the rubbers on your vehicles. Whenever it gets cold outside, notice that sometimes you come outside and you have a tire pressure warning on. Hey, your tire pressure's low. That's because of how cold it is, causing that air density to shrink down. It increases in density, but because it occupies less space, that's why your tires may seem as if they're low on air. As they naturally warm up, whether it be through driving or just daytime heating, most of the time, it's happened to me in several instances. I'll wake up, turn the car on, TPMS warning light goes on, and then as I'm driving around lunch or later in the afternoon, it just magically goes off. That's because everything starts to expand and loosen up a little bit and occupy more of that space inside the tire. Same thing with rubbers and plastics. They shrink in cold, they increase in warm, or they kind of grow in, or they expand a little bit in the warmth. And so over the eastern United States, I'll go ahead and pull this up for us real quick. Let me go back to that page. I always seem to do that. I want my handy dandy pen tool. This is where you're going to, wow. Sorry about that. This is where you will naturally see higher heights. So in this case, even looking from the top down at the Earth, where you see those contour lines, the white lines going up, that would indicate that you're increasing the vertical height of your atmosphere. Warm air is likely somewhere in that neck of the woods. Down across the eastern United States, where I have my yellow line kind of drawn at an angle starting from James Bay in Canada down all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, that is your actual trough. That's what's helping to pump down gratuitous amounts of polar air, frigid, freezing air from Canada. You can see where my arrow is drawn going right down into the southeast and the mid-Atlantic. That is where our continuous feed of cold air currently is. We have an outstanding article that I just drafted up that's being published to clickorlando.com if you want to read a little bit more about how the jet stream behaves and how it constantly is in rhythm, in motion, rotating around the northern hemisphere of the Earth. Pretty interesting. I'm going to break that down a little bit further into the Just Weather Live or Just Weather episode today that I'm going to be uploading later this afternoon. But you can see that right after that first trough, we get another very powerful jet max right there. And again, forgive me if the contour lines kind of blur things together. I'll zoom in for you as well, where you can see this shading of white and purple right there where I just kind of zigzagged through. That is called a jet max. And what that tells me is this low pressure system that's up and through here. Right here, I'll draw it in for you. We have a nice little low pressure riding the periphery of that jet max. That means we have a very strong gradient of somewhat warmer temps to the south and very much so colder temps to the north. That is what creates your jet. The jet is primarily created, those strong winds way up high in the atmosphere. It's just temperature discontinuity. On the north side of it, you have cold temps, and on the south side, you have warm temps. And as you rapidly change between the two, that's what increases that gradient of winds well above our heads, up at almost 10, 20,000 feet in the air. That's where you get your jet. And when you see those very strong jet maxes like that, that's where you can determine, okay, we have a very powerful punch of cold air coming down. We're probably going to get a really good weather event up there for the Great Lakes, southern Canada, the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic United States, maybe even a little bit of severe weather down across the plains and the Ohio, Mississippi Valley. We'll have to watch the Midwest. This area is typically prone to severe weather with each of the new introductions of these strong punches of cold polar and eventually Arctic air. We're not quite into the Arctic air just yet. I've been seeing that floating around. It's not Arctic quite yet. So as that rotates on through, notice what happens to a large majority of the United States. We're underneath predominant ridging here. It's a very low amplitude. It's very broad ridging, kind of like those very broad, worn-out speed bumps you'll see in certain areas around the local area, your neighborhood, or shopping plazas. But then also check this out. We have a trough that's embedded within the ridge. This is where things can get a little wonky. And truthfully, this is kind of where I've been watching for the potential for severe weather through Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Louisiana, getting up into Arkansas as well, maybe into Kansas before spreading out further to the east, maybe influencing our weather down here in Florida as that continues to work off towards the east. Because notice how sharp that looks. And then we have just behind that a very powerful reinforcing dome of cold air. This one much further to the south. Look at that. It goes almost north-south as it exits parts of Canada, goes through Montana, the Dakotas, into the Great Basin, Intermountain west of the Rockies, and then really digs in across the southern plains before almost taking on what would be considered a negative tilt like so. Negative tilt meaning we have a lot of cold air coming down really fast, and instead of the trough kind of taking on its traditional phase, it kind of walks its way this way and starts to bow forward as opposed to backwards because of how fast and how much oomph that cold air is. So a couple big cold air outbreaks and potential severe weather makers that we're tracking down the road. We'll take a look at the actual GFS future radar here to see exactly what that's thinking. So there goes that first one. You can see all that snow and heavy rainfall for parts of the mid-Atlantic. Even down along the Gulf coastline, we're getting some rainfall as that front comes down into we go into the end portions of this week and into next week. And then finally, watch what happens here. You see what's going on down across the south? This is precisely why I'm wondering if we're going to get some severe weather. Here comes that next nosh of cold air. There's some faint blue lines. I'll zoom you in again one more time. Faint blue arrows coming in out of the northwest here, but then you have a strong surge of Caribbean and Mexico, or Gulf of Mexico, warm tropical or subtropical air coming in, and that interaction is what's famous for producing tornadoes. If you've ever watched the Discovery Channel or the Learning Channel back in the day, they always say the cool, dry air from the north and the warm, wet air from the south. As they interact, that's what gets you your tornadoes. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but this is a textbook setup for seeing something along the lines of a scenario like that begin to unfold. And then look at what happens down for us in the southeast. We start to get even more of that rainfall. Unfortunately, it looks like because of the timing on this, another nocturnal front, we're not going to have the stability or the instability and the moisture, the daytime heating available to give us some rain, let alone severe weather. So as of now, over the last 12 hours, models have very heavily backed off on the threats for severe weather here down in the southeast, for Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and definitely here in Florida. Hoping for some rain because it's been very dry. We did get some good rainfall in some areas with the passage of this last polar front that brought down our temps as much as they did, but that's going to kind of be the song and dance. And when we come back from our break here in a second, I'll tell you why. So don't go anywhere. We're going to take a quick 2 minutes. Just going to get everything else pulled up for the back end of this stream. We're going to talk Enzo, La Nina, El Nino, and just tease a little bit at the 2025 hurricane season. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And welcome back. For those of you still over on the News 6 Plus, as well as the News 6 YouTube channel, we have quite the intimate group with us this morning. Makes sense, no worries. There really isn't anything big or anything crazy out there to talk in the weather sphere. So we're going to quickly go into a bit of an educational segment, talking the differences between El Nino and La Nina, and especially how that's going to influence not only the United States weather pattern for the months of December, January, and February, but particularly Florida and the rest of the Southeast. So here we go. This is a look at El Nino's setup. This is what we had to go through last winter time. For those of you who were here down in Florida, whether it be on vacation, riding out the colder temps up north, trying to escape the cold outbreaks that were occurring up in the Northeast, or anywhere in the United States for that matter, we did have a cooler than normal winter, as well as lots of severe weather. I chased a few of them up there in northern Florida and the Panhandle, where we had prolific tornado outbreaks, dozens upon dozens of reported tornadoes with these El Nino subtropical systems that would rock their way through, starting in Texas and working their way through through the upper Gulf coastline, Florida, before ejecting towards the north and east up the eastern seaboard. That's going to be a bit different this season. As you can see here, when we move forward in the panel, there's your wetter than normal winter versus your drier than normal winter to the north. That's as a result of the weird configuration you get in both your polar front jet, which is to the north, and then a enhanced or strengthened, reinforced subtropical jet as a result of the shear and all the vigorous instability that a warm El Nino setup plays in the equatorial Pacific. So when we move forward, you can see we're going to go from a night and day difference here. This is now a look at the La Nina pattern, where a lot of our coldest temps, notice I say coldest, doesn't mean we're not going to see cold weather, period, down here in the south. As we can step outside right now and see for ourselves, we're still sitting in the 50s right now and only expected to warm up to the low 60s during the, quote, warmest part of the day. However, in general, this is your setup for a La Nina winter. Now, there's a couple of give and takes here, because La Nina was forecast to come in back in May or June of this year, back as we went out of spring into the actual calendar summertime and the hurricane season. That's where a lot of the preseason forecasts for the 25, 28, 30-plus named storms came from. And that forecast didn't quite verify. In fact, Climate Prediction Center, even as of this morning, has us still in a bit more of a very weak La Nina, more so cool neutral, which means we're neither La Nina or El Nino out there in the Pacific. And that's going to play a role as we go forward in time. I'll click the button here one more so we can see exactly where the rainfall is likely to establish itself predominantly again. That's going to be the key takeaway here. Obviously, there's going to be anomalous patterns. There's going to be blockage in the jet. There's going to be different changes on a regional scale as opposed to a national scale that could influence this a little bit. So we're not saying it's going to just be warm from December, January, February, etc. It's not going to just be rainy in the Great Lakes, rainy in the Pac Northwest. We are going to get some rain down here, but as the article mentioned on clickorlando.com, one of the biggest things we ought to be prepared for as we go into our La Nina winter is the drought. We're already starting to see dryness kicking up around here in central Florida, so we need to do what we can to protect our gardens, protect our vegetation, and especially protect those lawns, because I'm getting a little tired of seeing mine browning over despite however many times I crank my sprinkler system before I head out for the day. That will be the general takeaway for our La Nina winter. Now, that's not going to stick forever. For some strange reason, and I say strange reason because this doesn't usually happen. This is one time where I will cave in and say that. I know on YouTube and other social media, you're always seeing the thumbnails or the posts, this just got worse, or this just got weird. A lot of the time it's not, but in this case I can wholeheartedly and truthfully tell you it is a little bizarre to see that we're barely sneaking into a La Nina and then coming right back out of it. And there's going to be implications to that. There's several of them that myself and meteorologist Jonathan Kagis are digesting and looking through behind the scenes to hopefully get you guys more recurring content on either a bi-weekly or a month-to-month basis. As, of course, we go through winter, we get into spring, and the next thing you know, the 2025 hurricane season is upon us. So let's go forward one more time. This is the neutral setup. So notice here, this is kind of where we are right now. Climate Prediction Center still thinks we're going to see more of a La Nina really establish itself by the end of December. I mean, we've already kind of been going back and forth from that threshold. If I were to pull up the actual indices and the temps out there in our different regions of the ENSO, we can talk about that on a later point in time. But if you look at the weather map that I showed you all earlier, and you kind of remember that and harken back to the first block of the show versus that diagram there, that's kind of where we're sitting currently. We're going to get more towards that La Nina pattern, so maybe into January and February, we could see more of the drought setup, the drying conditions, the warmer conditions down here in the southeast, the deep southern plains. But then as we tread back towards a neutral, we're going to start to see a bit more of a severe weather season, I think, through the months of March, especially April, and then rounding out in May. And then where does that put us on the calendar? Oh, what do you know? Going right into the 25 hurricane season. So Jonathan and I are going to be working on some preseason forecasts and some preseason discussions behind the scenes, because if this does hold true and the Enzo forecasting doesn't break us like it did this year, everybody was anticipating a strong rockin' La Nina. I remember there were some meteorologists from different areas mentioning a historic La Nina, and that was as far away from reality Mother Nature showed us than it could possibly be. But, however, I will show you this. We're going to go forward in time just a little bit more. This is going to be your neutral phase. So we are still going to continue to see rainfall down in the southeast, the mid-Atlantic. This could potentially help our snow producers for the mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, the Great Lakes. We've already had a lot of lake effect going on near the Great Lakes into the Northeast. That will likely continue through this month. If we start to tread more towards a La Nina, that could change. And then obviously we're going to revert back to this. Right now, it does not seem like we're going to bounce into an El Nino again. Definitely doesn't look like that. And in fact, what I'll do, I don't have it pulled up anymore for the sake of saving bandwidth, but I wanted to show you all the month-to-month forecasts, and perhaps I'll pull that up for my Just Weather video I'll be uploading later today. So if you want to check that out after this live update, feel free to do so. It'll drop again later in the afternoon, perhaps early evening time frame. Once Jonathan and I do our little shift change powwow, we'll figure out exactly when we want to schedule that to go live. But this is where it gets interesting, because if we go back into a neutral, first of all, this is your El Nino. We're all very familiar with that for the tropics. We get a lot of wind shear. Usually, 2023 was an El Nino. We saw the fourth most number of storms in history that hurricane season. So El Nino doesn't always quite do it. And just like with everything else in weather, one or two variables by themselves are not going to dictate what your big picture forecast looks like. There's so many other intricate pieces to the puzzle that go into it. But then moving right along, this is your neutral pattern. So neutral means we're going to have normal trade winds, not only through the Pacific. You can see those arrows moving from the east toward the west in the Pacific, but I do think that's also what helped to influence the destructive season that we had this hurricane season. We had a lot of systems forming out in the Atlantic that ended up moving off towards the west. And when I say systems, I don't necessarily only mean our named systems, but also tropical waves, rainmaker disturbances, features that started off the coast of Africa, the Cabo Verde Islands, moved either through or just to the north of the Lesser Antilles, and then maybe wandered their way into an area a bit more favorable for that tropical development. We saw that a lot this hurricane season. We had a couple of them. We had Kervin out in the Atlantic. We had Joyce out there, as well as Leslie. Gordon really didn't do anything to us as well. Those were our four fish storms, the bona fide fish storms that didn't do anything to anybody out there. But there were a lot of instances. Alberto, Chris was a short-lived tropical system that came from Africa, wiggled its way through the Antilles into the Caribbean, and then finally, when it got into the Bay of Campeche, it popped off, tropical storm, and then made landfall. Debbie, another example, a dry tropical wave that finally got its act together to the south of Cuba, made landfall in Florida. So what I'm getting at here, and we're not sounding the alarm, God forbid, no way I would ever do that to y'all. It's December 3rd. Let's get through the holidays. Let's get through my birthday early next year and everybody else who may be celebrating certain things between now and we'll say maybe April-ish of next year. I'm just kind of putting the puzzle pieces together already. I'm a big fan of looking long range, and neutral seasons tend to play a role more so on keeping the weather threats in place for Florida, whether it be during the winter or the spring, but then especially into the hurricane season. So that's kind of why we're talking a little bit of everything. Winter could be somewhat weird because we're going to be right on that threshold of La Nina, neutral, La Nina, neutral, and then as we wander back towards spring and then summertime, we could possibly come completely out of a La Nina and into a neutral phase once again. And obviously, as we get closer in time, we'll be able to dial in those other intricate puzzle pieces I alluded to a few minutes ago. But neutral being on the table tells me and us here at the Pinpoint Weather Team at News 6 that the 25 hurricane season should be taken serious. 2024 taught us that it ain't over until it's over. But with that being said, thank you all very much for tuning in today. Thank you for taking some time out of your Tuesday morning to join me here on News 6 Plus in the News 6 YouTube channel. I hope you have a great rest of your day. We will be live here once again at 11:30 tomorrow morning. But until then, have a great rest of your Tuesday. We'll see you again soon. This is the Digital Weather Center signing out.